Hi, and welcome to AEI. This is our event on cybersecurity and supply chain management. We're starting this event with our guest, Congressman uh, Mike Gallagher, who is serving his first term in Congress from the representing Wisconsin's 8th district. I have to say, as a Big Ten myself, I'm glad that we're getting Big Ten football back. I have no idea how that's going to work, but yay us. He serves on the Armed Services and House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. He also was a co-chair of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission report that came out 6 months ago. And if anyone took the time to read it, they were probably thinking it was mostly about cybersecurity. But those of us who did read the 183 pages know that a lot of it actually is pertained to the preparedness that we needed to have for COVID. So it was really interesting. You guys did a lot of work, and I think diligence beyond where you thought you were headed in just the cyber area. Congressman Gallagher earned his master's degree in security studies and a second degree in strategic intelligence, which is something that we really need now. And I appreciate that your expertise is exceptionally being used in Congress. He joined the United States Marine Corps the day he graduated from college and has served 7 years in active duty prior to becoming a supply chain expert in his company at Green Bay that he worked for. So we really welcome you today. We are appreciative that you are a former staffer, you know what you're talking about, and we have you in Congress. So I just want to say thank you for all the service that you've done, and we really appreciate having you a guest today.
Thanks for having me. Most importantly, I used to work for Rob Strayer, who's going to be joining you later. So he's got all sorts of dirt on me if you want to destroy my political career. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to start with the elephant in the room, which is a little bit supply chain issue, but we all woke up this morning to TikTok and WeChat potentially being banned on Sunday from an executive order from the Department of Commerce. And somebody who spends a lot of time in that space, I immediately started getting phone calls saying, how does this work and how does this make us different than what China is doing? And so I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, I've been persuaded by the arguments of a fellow Wisconsinite named Ben Thompson, who writes an amazing blog called Stratechery. And I think he really laid this out a few months ago, basically making the case that, we are not, there's no equivalence here. The fact is whether it's social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, we allow Chinese Communist Party apparatchiks to exploit these platforms while denying access to their own citizens and denying access for U.S. companies to mainland China. And so at some point, we have to insist upon reciprocity in our relationship. And particularly when it comes to technological competition, we have to insist on reciprocity. As it pertains to this specific development with TikTok, I've supported the ban on TikTok, particularly when it comes to active duty DoD using it. And I think the administration is largely headed in the right direction. However, without having scrutinized the details, I think any sale of sort of a US portion of TikTok that still allowed the parent company to control the underlying algorithm would be a little bit problematic. But the fact is, and this should be a wake-up call to industry and government, the reason TikTok is so popular is because it's a very good product. It's a product that its consumers like a lot. And so the fact that we got beat on that shouldn't be that should be a wake up call, I think, for both industry and the federal government. So I guess I would say, devil's still in the details. I don't even know if the latest with Oracle has been finalized right now, but at least we're, right now the government is waking up to the threat posed by companies like this.
And it brings us to another part that you really focused on in the report, which is the combination of the public-private partnership. It's been a hard challenge in the cyberspace for a long time. The government was running their own intelligence, and we weren't having the cross share of information from both U.S. companies and a lot of the companies that and governments we work with, especially the Five Eyes. So have you seen changes since you guys started working on this report and the report came out last March? Is it getting better?
Well, I think, obviously our final report was released on March 11th, if I remember. And so that was very inauspicious timing, let's say. 48 hours later, the Capitol shut down. And I think our rollout may have been the last public event that was held at the U.S. Capitol for at least a few months. So a lot of things got overshadowed by the pandemic. Behind the scenes, we're continuing to work to get a lot of our recommendations effectuated into law via the National Defense Authorization Act. And we actually are pretty cautiously optimistic on that. But I think the pandemic itself was a huge wake-up call for everybody that, it's easy to take critical supply chains for granted up until the moment you no longer have them. And what's true in the medical space is doubly true in the increasingly critical information and communications technology space. And the fact is, in America, we lack key industrial capacities for the mass production of essential technologies, including, 5G telecommunications equipment. Take your pick. It's forced critical dependency on production in China and led to risks around the trustworthiness and availability of critical components and technologies. And I think also it's undermined American and partner economic competitiveness. So I think the private sector is waking up, and Congress, which is very slow to act sometimes, is waking up. We've begun to take action to eliminate some of these dependencies through a variety of forward-looking bills, including the Endless Frontiers Act, which would be a generational investment in R&D, the Chips for America Act, the USA Telecommunications Act. At the same time, the very kind of disparate efforts in the executive branch have also aimed at managing supply chain risks to the federal government with the private sector as a partner. Unfortunately, I would say these initiatives, while admirable and worthy of support, lack organizing principles and an overarching strategic approach. And that's really what we're arguing for in the report. It's how can we compete effectively with China, because China does not have that same problem. The CCP has an industrial-based strategy. It's guided by Made in China 2025, China Standards 2035, the whole doctrine of military civil fusion. They've effectively seized market share in critical technologies and components through a mix of investments, engagements in standards and other international fora, and other protectionist policies. So in order to facilitate competition with the growing Chinese economic prowess in these technologies, we need to build more secure supply chains. And it's time the U.S. develop and implement a high-tech industrial strategy in concert with our allies and partners.
Yeah, I know that 5G is huge. We talk about that in next generation networks quite a bit. And there was a big event on ORAN at the FCC earlier this week. It's been eye-opening, I think, for a lot of people who this was just off their radars to see, all the points of presence that you can cause trouble and friction in this process. Are we seeing more help? I know that South Korea has always been really diligent about this. They actually have a huge fab for their semiconductors in Austin, and the CHIPS Act, I think, is going to be huge once we get that through. And I've learned so much about semiconductors, which we're going to talk about later on this. But I know Taiwan, we have concerns about. How are we doing with our partners?
I think we're making progress. Well, maybe I'll just take a step back as it relates to 5G, and then we can get into semiconductors. I think it's fair to say that for most of the last 4 years, we've played largely a defensive game, right? And in 5G, this has amounted to a consistent argument that Huawei and ZTE are bad. Huawei and ZTE are bad. They can't be trusted. We have had, all the evidence in the public square now to make the case that there's counterintelligence concerns to using Huawei and ZTE 5G equipment. Where we haven't been as aggressive and where I think we need to go is sort of the offensive component of that, right? Because there's a lot of countries that are making 5G decisions that, they may care about CI concerns or Intel concerns in general, but they're more interested in just getting cheap internet. And Huawei and ZTE can obviously undercut their international competitors, Nokia and Ericsson, because they get massive state support. But often what I hear from our partners is that the real advantage they have is they offer an integrated solution, right? It's like 5G in a box. Whereas if you go with a non-Huawei Western alternative, you have to contract with multiple different players. And so I do think we need to think long and hard with our international partners, and not just Nokia and Ericsson, but all the countries that have a role to play in this, starting with our Five Eyes partners, about how can we better play that offensive game? How can we pool our resources together in order to convince non-aligned countries to make key decisions in the next few years that will have impact for decades to come. Easier said than done. We have a lot of complicated anti-monopoly laws in the U.S. that make that very difficult. And as you alluded to, even some of our closest partners like Taiwan have concerns. But I guess I would say on balance, we've played defense well. Now it's time to go on offense. And part of that is some sort of industrial policy here in the United States, which starts with just identifying what are the key materials, components, and finished products that are critical to the national and economic security of the United States. what's a risk-based approach that will allow us to identify where we need to invest more heavily, where the federal government needs to work with industry, partner countries, state and local governments to identify key equipment and components and materials that follow for assembly. And I'm not sure we've done that yet to the level we need to do.
So let's talk about the CHIPS Act, because I think that is an example of where you're getting it right on a lot of fronts. You've identified that we need to pull manufacturing back into the United States because the R&D is done here, but then the manufacturing gets pushed to a place that's more economical. If we can bring that back, and candidly using the power of the purse of the US government to kind of collaborate with some of our other major tech companies to say there's enough business to bring it back here. And I know that Governor Ducey has been good about that in Arizona. Texas has been, I don't know, you might have some stuff going on in Wisconsin. I'm just not familiar with it, but there's certainly, we're putting opportunities on the table right now.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the CHIPS Act is crucial. I think it's fair for me to say you'll see reference to it in forthcoming reports from the House and those of us who work on China in the House. I think if you ask all the tech geeks that are really involved in this space, semiconductors and chips are at the top of the list of things, we need to invest in. I mean, if you think about this in terms of what I talked about, the identification of critical materials and equipment, we could start to point out some obvious things like weapon systems and telecommunications equipment and certain general purpose computing equipment. But semiconductors and chips are more complicated to produce, and they require more technical manufacturing capability. I mean, these components might require more technical manufacturing capability because they involve repurposing existing manufacturing in a way that might not be feasible right off the bat. And there's a lot going on there, and we disinvested for years in that area. And so I'm actually optimistic about the CHIPS Act, at least to sort of start the conversation around semiconductors in the U.S. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it starts off from a bipartisan and bicameral position, which always increases the likelihood that a bill is going to get across the finish line. And if nothing else, I think it's forcing DOD and a lot of other actors in the executive branch to have very important conversations with industry and with key allies to figure out how can we nearshore or onshore the production of things that we just can't be dependent on the largesse of the Chinese Communist Party for the production of them, like semiconductors and chips.
Going to the other side of the equation, this is where I had a bit of a challenge with the report was when you're in the beginning of the process in the supply chain with something like semiconductors, you have at least the ability to have some control. When you get to the other end where we have a lot of concern, and this may be something that next generation networks helps us, is with Internet of Things. So the out of the box, capability of a lot of things that for that to go to a consumer level, it needs to be at an expense point that people are willing to buy it, and security is expensive. So that has been a kind of an ongoing challenge. I know our friends at CTA, the Consumer Technology Association, is very worried about an added cost on that, but yet security is really important. So did you guys address that? Is that something we can take a deeper look into?
Well, I think what you'll see throughout the final report of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission is a good faith attempt to navigate between the competing priorities that your question alludes to, which is to say, how do we incentivize both the federal government and the private sector to invest more heavily in cybersecurity, while also not saddling them with a ton of new onerous regulations that will destroy their business or put them at a price point where they lose their customers and therefore disadvantage foreign companies. I'd be lying to you if I said that's always an easy needle to thread. But we tried to thread it, and we tried to take an approach that was fundamentally a free market approach. And so in the report, wherever you see us advocating for, enhanced security in supply chains, we're trying to do it with an incentive-based approach as opposed to a one-size-fits-all based approach. One area where I think we would love your scrutiny, and one area of the report I would draw attention to, is a recommendation where we suggest Congress should establish and fund a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority that would be empowered to establish and manage a program for voluntary security certifications and labeling of information and communication technology products is sort of like a blue check mark if you hit the standards. I mean, obviously there are costs to that as well, but I just highlight that as one example of where we tried not to be too prescriptive. We tried to understand that even the simplest piece of regulation or law in DC quickly gets complicated when, you're forcing small and medium-sized companies to deal with it. But that was definitely the intent of our report, was to, retain, incentivize the private sector to do the right thing without forcing them to do a bunch of things that the federal government is just not in a position to be advising them to do.
Yeah, the certification process is always a good idea, and it's a challenge on the fact that when it comes out of the box, I always use my phone as an example, that the first thing that happens when I get a new phone is you need to update it, right? It's like it's been sitting in the box, and since then, they've done one more thing. So getting people to understand that the item has the ability to be updated is actually what we're looking for, not necessarily that it is perfect coming out of the box. But it's all very important. I mean, that's a very important part of it, is making sure that you can constantly update. And then, people don't know when they have things that are no longer really working or possibly vulnerable in their system unless they spend a lot of time and energy on this. So, notifications, I think, will be interesting as well. The other thing that is counterfeits. And I know that there's a lot of work, and there's some really smart companies, especially when I've been getting information from Israel, that's looking at how do we fabric in, the identity and the ability to understand this from the very beginning on whether or not I'm getting a counterfeit device. So somebody like, in a network operation will make sure that they're getting legit stuff.
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't address it specifically in the report, or the counterfeit problem. Just quickly on your, not to go too far afield, but your point about updates. This is brilliantly illustrated.
I can keep out on this for a long time, so be careful.
is what is my new favorite TV show, which is Cobra Kai on Netflix, which is all about a guy stuck in the 80s trying to navigate the perils of the present day. And at one point, he finally gets a smartphone and learns how to use the internet, and he gets an update, and he's like, well, I just got this thing. What's going on? Why do I need an update? So you're definitely on point with that.
Yeah.
I guess I would say, I mean, this gets to having an overall ICT industrial-based strategy, right? And I think I just want to be very clear here. We recognize that you can't solve all of the problems in the supply chain, or even just the defense supply chain, overnight. We're really advocating for carving out ICT as an area where we prioritize and focus, just because it is going to be so important in the near term and over the long term. And I think if we can do that, we can start to get increasing confidence in the supply chain that allows us to tackle things like counterfeit devices. But it's obviously a very, very complex thing, and it's not going to be solved overnight. But I don't know. I could be naive, and I'd welcome a counterpoint. But I sense a bipartisan momentum behind a variety of these initiatives. Every piece of legislation I've introduced on 5G, or just anything at the intersection of China and tech on the Armed Services Committee, has been exceptionally bipartisan. On the Armed Services Committee, I think both parties are talking about the need to reestablish U.S. technological superiority and investment as part of an overall strategy to compete effectively with China. I almost think, regardless of what happens in November, there's going to be some inevitable momentum behind some of these proposals. But maybe that's wishful thinking, because I want to see all of the work of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission outlast my time in Congress.
No, I think it all starts with a plan. I think that there's a lot of confusion about China bad, yet almost everything on my desk came from China, right? And so where is it bad? Where is it good? And where are we having collaborative efforts? And part of that is making sure that, policy makers understand that. And I definitely think, there's been a lot of criticism that this administration didn't have a very cohesive 5G plan. And I never found that to be the case. And there are probably moments. I don't think it should be nationalized. I'm very clear about that. But I do think that, as somebody, Rob Strayer is going to be talking to us later, has really been the point of the spear in the international forum forums with the telecommunications operators and how we manage that, and going to it's challenging for other countries because we don't have a minister of communications, and so they're always trying to figure out who they talk to here. And Ajit Pai, the chairman of the FCC, has been very poignant on this, as have almost all the commissioners. They haven't been doing as much travel because of what's been going on, but I think we have really done a good job continuing the dialogues. But you guys have to start with a plan, and you've done that, which I think is really, really helpful.
Well, could I note, I mean, what I was joking before we started with Rob that, we have a recommendation in there that I call the Strayer promotion plan, though he's left now, but elevating his position within the org chart of Secretary of State in order to allow us to more actively and effectively engage in the forums where international standards are being set for ICT technology. And I think Rob has done a phenomenal job over the last few years, but I think it's fair to say there's more we can do, and certainly more we as Congress can do to support him and all the other members of the executive branch that are out there in the trenches every single day, battling it out or boxing out, CCP apparatchiks that are showing up in all these forums. And so I absolutely think there's more we can do just to show up and make a fundamentally American or Five Eyes based argument in the international standard setting bodies.
Yeah, the standard setting bodies have been, something that it's way too in the weeds for most people to take the time to understand. But the Chinese definitely have their game on, and they have got a collaborative effort that is global, and we need to be on point at all times around that. One thing actually going.
Oh,
you
sorry.
mentioned earlier, sorry, just say that I know that that's one of the things that the Germans have been dealing with is Germany's exports most of their cars. The majority of their cars get exported to Asia, especially China. And so if they aren't buying Huawei equipment, they've made it very clear that can become a problem. So there's the whole Belt and Road element to this as well, which goes beyond just technology, but we're seeing it really heavily now in the digital elements of what they're bringing in and who's spending money and where they want the money to go.
And one thing we are considering right now, as we really try and take the framework of the Solarium report and build out kind of an ICT focused strategy or a series of subsidiary recommendations, is whether on the Intel side, we need something, we need to build and designate a national supply chain intelligence center, right? So we can be better positioned for, fusing and disseminating relevant information to key stakeholders, and key members of the private sector. So little things like that where, we think that the federal government can do a better job, not only engaging in international fora, but routinely disseminating critical information to the private sector and getting past this need to know mentality towards a need to share mentality. And over time, I think that's how we believe you get better collaboration between the private sector and the public sector, because as we all know, particularly in cyber, 85% of the critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So that's kind of the main effort. And the federal government needs to understand that in a lot of ways, it's the supporting effort, not the main effort.
Do you think the liability reform has gone far enough for the private entities to feel comfortable sharing across the transom?
I guess the honest answer is I don't know.
I think that's the whole.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I think that's the holdup. It has been for a long time. You go talk to a general counsel at a big company, and they are like, okay, so I give it to the government, and then what happens? They just really feel uncomfortable with that. And if you can resolve that problem, I think the flow is important. Plus, because it's 0-day attacks, right? We need to make sure if they're attacking, they're using it in multiple places. And I don't do COVID jokes, but I used to say this is like the CDC. The faster we can find something, we can contain it, we can figure out what's causing it. It's the same thing in cyber, just that we couldn't get the private entities to share with the government because there was always that fear that they were going to be liable.
Yeah, and I think we talked a lot about, how do you incentivize the 11060 reporting, right? Where, the industry standard becomes you have, detect an intrusion on your network within 1 minute, you have an expert looking at it within 10 minutes, and then, you prevent a breakout within 60 minutes, and your average breakout time is near that. So, we, in the report, you'll see, for example, we suggest mandatory penetration testing for at least major companies, publicly traded and listed companies, things like that. We just, there's a lot of things where over time we start to just send the signal from the federal government, but also get the C-suite to send the signal that you really need to prioritize this. And I think our hope is that it results in a better collaboration between the private and public sectors.
Oddly, compliance can make things go, they fix things sometimes that is not the intent, but you're like, once people have to comply and they have to show that they have licenses for a lot of things change. It's good. It's not always a bad thing. I have one question in the chat here, which I've been trying to read, so just apologize ahead of time. It says, there is not really a cohesive plan around this with that does not anti-China language this administration is concerning. So potentially provoking more protectionist actions against our supply chain. I think there's a question in there. I think.
If I understand it, it's the administration's, like, let's say the 301 investigation and tariffs is fundamentally protectionist and provoking a protectionist response. So I've been largely or highly supportive of the 301 investigation. I think it's a very solid piece of work. It's a very voluminous piece of work, and a lot of research went into it. I'm also someone who has not been supportive of the 232 tariffs against our allies. And that really gets to, I think, what is the response to your question, which is, you can either pick a fight with China or you can pick a fight with our allies, but you can't do both simultaneously. And our challenge right now, particularly in the midst of a coronavirus pandemic, is to get on the same page with our allies and say, hey, look, I mean, this illustrates what we've known for a long time, which is that the Chinese Communist Party is not a trusted partner on the world stage, or at least it has a set of values that are inimical to Western values and where we want our NATO alliance or our Five Eyes alliance to go. And so I think if we can make that argument effectively, we can actually open up markets and reduce barriers with our European allies in particular, but all over the world. And I would say, just on the economic side of the equation, I think priority one for a second Trump term or even a first Biden term should be to strike a gold standard trade agreement with a post-Brexit UK, one that has a docking provision where if other countries can meet that high standard, they're able to easily join. Turning some of the progress we've made on incorporating Australia, for example, into our national technological industrial base, into actual real things that mean something and make it easier for us to collaborate on defense-related projects, which right now it's still pretty hard when it comes to the Aussies and the UK, and also a trade agreement with Taiwan. I understand there's some hesitancy in USTR, and there's a lot of people that don't want to jeopardize the phase one deal with China. But my own sense is we're going to be involved in some form of low-grade economic and ideological competition, if not warfare, with China for at least 3 decades. So it's time for us to unite the free world in opposition to our shared adversary.
So I know you are also on the China task force. Did we just get a preview?
Maybe the tone will be similar, but I'll just say quickly on that, we've had a remarkable few months of work on the China task force, and all the members that were appointed took the job very seriously. And I'm not saying this as like just a talking point. We made a good faith effort at the start to convince our Democratic colleagues to join it. And I think even though they refused for a variety of reasons, and the speaker has her reasons, you'll see in the final report that most of what we're advocating, if not almost everything, is pretty bipartisan. In fact, most of the areas where we're highlighting a particular bill, it's a bipartisan bill. And I think it just gets back to the point that there's an opportunity here to rebuild, I think, a bipartisan foundation for U.S. foreign policy. And most of the work I do on the Armed Services Committee is on China stuff and tech stuff is exceptionally bipartisan.
Oh, I'm very glad to hear that. And so the report's coming out in a week or two. We have it coming up soon.
A week-ish is the plan. We'll see. I think a week-ish. Unless I get in trouble with Chairman McCall.
In COVID time, that actually sounds like an accurate time scale. I think that's on my calendar now, weekish.
Yeah, that's right.
Like, I don't know what day it is, it just doesn't make any difference anymore. Well, I just want to thank you for all the work that you've been doing in this, especially in this area. I'm exceptionally excited about it. But just in general, I mean, I think luckily your colleagues are getting a little more savvy about this, probably weirdly because of TikTok and WeChat. They're having to figure out what all this means. I know I have several notes from some app developers that are concerned because sometimes technology and policy don't make a nice pairing, but please keep up the good work. And we really appreciate your time here at this AEI event today.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. And the final thing I'd say is, of course, We didn't get everything right in the Solarium report. We really want your feedback, and we'll hope you read it. It's available for free online. And as Congress gets more engaged in this, there's going to be things we screw up, right? I mean, Congress is a very blunt instrument, right? It's never going to be perfectly attuned to all the nuances in the private sector, but we really need the engagement of the no kidding experts in the think tank community and the private sector. And so, as with everything, it all comes back to Vince Lombardi's wisdom. You chase perfection and you catch excellence. So that's what we're after. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Congressman. Rob Strayer.
Hello.
Look at you. Sounds like you were right. You're getting a promotion from this report, and then you decided to move over to the Information Technology Industry Council.
I did.
Welcome.
Thank you.
How's your new job going?
It's going great. It's going great. And I just wanted to say, I want to thank people like you for, your abiding support along the way, and ability to work with those of us in government and show us things we may not have been aware of. And I would just say that interview with Congressman Gallagher was so impressive. His insights and his diligence and depth with which he understands these issues is truly impressive, knowing all the other things he has to do as a congressman. And I would say that across the board, that Solarium report is so broad-based. They did a tremendous amount of work in such a short period of time. So if I may just...
I was gonna say, I think we're getting lucky that, of course, I'm steeped in this stuff, so I never know if I'm like just super geeking out or more people are getting this. But I want to give you a huge thank you. You got into this and you stayed heavy and hard into this discussion for 4 years and ran around the globe until they, you couldn't get on an airplane anymore. So I know we started to talk a little bit about, with the congressman, about the standards process. Can you go a little heavier into that for us? Because that's kind of the unknown secret fabric that is driving a lot of how we're going to manage the supply chain situation.
Yeah, happy to do that. Let me just start it just maybe one level abstraction higher, and that is just for all the AI folks that are on now, just to make sure they fully get the reason why 5G is a really good example of why we need to pay attention to the supply chain and this kind of evolving issue of the supply chain becoming more of an important, not just economic issue, but national security issue. And as when we look at 5G, it's not static. We know about a 5G today that is largely sold as increased bandwidth and throughput capacity, which of course will accelerate the ability for our smartphones and other devices to connect to the internet. But really what the promise of 5G will be in these use cases that evolve over 5 or even 10 years that will basically be the foundation for all of our future critical infrastructure. So we're talking about the supply of electricity, of water, autonomous vehicles, and even automated manufacturing is going to be one of the key use cases for it. So because so much rides on it is why about 2 years ago, the US government, in collaboration with our key Five Eyes partners like Australia, as well as Japan and the Europeans, started working together to think more about how we needed to secure a 5G infrastructure. So that's what I did a lot of in my time in government, was this diplomatic effort to talk about this national security as well as the economic issues in this space. And that really culminated in the end with a number of countries adopting a stronger, basically risk-based, more fulsome risk-based assessments of 5G. And even in Europe, we saw in January them release a 5G security toolbox, which at least a dozen countries now in Europe have adopted concrete regulations under that 5G toolbox. So that's how it's evolved over time. Now, when it comes to the standards specifically, I'm only going to use one bad acronym, which is the 3GPP, the Third Generation Partnership Project. And that's really where the 5G specifications have been developed. About 8 years ago, the standard that they were shooting for was kind of defined and set out. But to build the specifications has been this consortium effort of leading private sector companies to develop these, if you will, standards for 5G. The release that set up what they call a standalone 5G network came out in 2018. So we've only had that around for about 2 years. There will continue, as I said earlier, to be a dynamic nature to this market. We'll continue to evolve. We'll see new use cases. That's all going to be done through standards processes. That's why the standards development process is so important. Governments can play a role in this, but at the end of the day, it's really been in a long history of the last 30 or 40 years of the development of technology related to the internet. The leaders have been companies developing the technology, and a meritocracy-based competition between those, so that the best technical solutions and the best ways of solving problems rise to the top and win out. So we need to continue to see that competition based on specific solutions, and not have government try to identify just one solution, say that's what we're going to go with this particular outcome. Government can facilitate, incentivize, and make it easier to collaborate, and encourage companies to do so, but it shouldn't be setting and trying to decide, pick the winner itself, or I mean, because that's only going to be an interim winner at best, and it's also probably not likely to be the correct one for the longer term success in the market. There's really great promise in the 5G area of being able to open up the architecture of 5G to have additional components. Traditionally, there's been very difficult for new companies to come into the market and provide particular components for particular aspects of the network if they weren't making the whole solution at once. So we're likely to see more of an open architecture, something they call Open RAN, Open Radio Access Network. We're also going to see a movement to more virtualization, so more software-defined functionality, where that previously had only been done with hardware, and hardware components take longer to produce, and there's a lot of advantages to having the functionality provided by software. So that virtualization is another key feature we're going to see emerge more and more in the years ahead. So government can help incentivize and even put R&D dollars into that, but and there still should be competition among the way that moves forward. And the last thing I just want to say, internationally, it's really important that whether it's the US government or other governments, that we continue to see world-leading technology companies collaborate together in this area to produce the new use cases, the ones I mentioned earlier, as well as new foundational technology to create things like 6G or other emerging network technologies. That's going to be very important. The US government has financing elements, one called the Export-Import Bank, another one called the Development Finance Corporation, that can help finance the development or purchase of of emerging technologies. The State Department has a program called the Digital Connectivity and Cybersecurity Partnership. USAID, our foreign assistance arm of the lead foreign assistance arm of government, also has money for this. So there's ways the US government's facilitating it. We've also heard from the United Kingdom talk about developing a D10, 10 democracies or so that would come together and help build out use cases. Those are very promising areas. Again, government can facilitate, but it will have to be private sector companies in the driver's seat working collaboratively. Government and private sector can work together with government money acting as a catalyst for these great outcomes. So we're kind of, the message we're rolling across is we're in a dynamic trajectory. We're not at just a static case in point in these markets. Thanks.
So I just want to know that I'm excited about 5G. Everybody loves a good acronym, but I promised Catherine Condello that we would talk about next generation networks, because 5G is a little specific to our wireless friends we love, but we love our cable friends and the people that wire the world too. So Catherine, I want to bring you into this conversation, and just by way, I'm sorry, I didn't do the normal intros because I feel like if you're watching this thing, you probably know who everybody is. But Catherine Condello is the Senior Director of National Security and Emergency Preparedness at Lumen. So we have to learn a new name. We used to call them CenturyLink, but they just recently, changed their name. I'm sure that somebody made $1 million coming up with a word like Lumen. But Catherine, he's talking about your business. I mean, you've got a government partner here who's trying to, not only make things more secure, but they're also probably putting some obligations onto the equipment that you guys are buying. So tell us how you evolve into that, especially with your cybersecurity awareness hat on.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, I think Rob sort of kicked off things in a good way. I guess there's a couple of things I do want to sort of make sure that people understand. Everyone is very much focused on 5G. Good, I'm glad they're focused on 5G. But Lumen, which is not a wireless company per se, like let's say an AT&T or Verizon or a British Telecom or something like that. We call this digital transformation, sort of the fourth industrial revolution. And in the wireline space and in the the Lumen space, this is changing the environment so that we're focused now on delivering applications and data and services And we're not doing it in sort of the traditional cloud versus premise versus transport versus this, in essence, is an environment that's going to prioritize the end user services that they've dictated through, enabling, the fastest, bestest, most efficient, most secure, depending on what they want, sort of transport and management of those kind of capabilities. And doing it in a way that, if promised correctly, will be done in an environment where you can connect all these things irrespective of location. It can be, in essence, agnostic, location agnostic. And these are some of the tenets and the principles, that they're sort of creating, that are part of the, let's say, the Lumen platform. And so why do I talk about this? Well, doesn't that sound an awful lot like 5G? So what we in the wireline space, or the Wi-Fi space, the satellite space, even the broadcasters who are all moving into this kind of environment, what the wireless guys call 5G, we call next generation, or in the case of Lumen, fourth industrial revolution. So when we're looking at this sort of thing, I think the key words that we're looking at and the things that we are looking at, certainly within Lumen and in the other segments other than wireless in the sector, is how do we, one, make this happen faster? Make this actually happen faster. When we're looking at sort of some of the new capabilities that are going to, in essence, be driven by customers, whether it's DoD or the federal government or the banks or transportation of the cities, what we've already seen already is, and I think Gartner has a quote where, they anticipate that by 2025, which is only, 4 or 5 years from now, that 75% of enterprise generated data is not going to be done, in the, it's not going to be done in a data center or a cloud. In essence, it's going to be done near to their edge. And that's up, 75% is up from the 20% today. Well, given the time frame of that, what that's really saying is that this is going to be done over a wired environment, not because they're not moving lickety split in the wireless space, but in essence, it just sort of demonstrates that it's not just the wireless access that's important in this next generation, but all of the major access platforms. So, and I'm not trying to make this a wired versus a wireless battle. That's not the point. The point is that when we're looking at next generation, I think our key words to certainly the federal government and all our partners in this is that we can't lose sight of the thought that it's actually bigger, and to Rob's point, maybe take it up a level. So what we are thinking about is that, we need to be, to Rob's point, be focusing on standards, but the standards that we think, are ultimately going to position the US and like-minded countries and vendors and whatever to a position of higher security are going to be the standards that focus on interoperability. Not just the O-RAN interoperability, but all aspects across all access points. So for instance, we, Lumen, are very much engaged in developing interoperability standards in Ethernet networks, in the Metro Ethernet Forum. Now, I don't know if people are aware of that, but Ethernet in essence runs cities. So if we can have interoperability in the Ethernet that's running Minneapolis versus St. Paul versus Chicago versus that, in essence, pushes forward the adoption of this kind of capability, where ultimately the end user, whether once again it's DoD or major customers, get to say, I want to be able to handle my traffic and my applications and my services through these networks and not those. So it puts the capability of that kind of security, whatever they want for their application services or their operations, sort of more in their control. And furthermore, in the interoperability piece, while we're very much focusing on O-RAN, or in our case, Metro Ethernet, we also feel that it needs to dive deeper. We need to be talking about the underlying thing that's running everything in the next generation networks, which of course, to Rob's point, is software-defined networking and network function virtualizations. Well, even in that space, people have been having the big discussions about, oh, what's bad about, is it open source versus non-open source? Well, that's an interesting conversation. But here too, interoperability, in particular of the application programming interfaces, APIs, the interoperability of the instantiations of, let's say, various NFVs that you might put into a host, are all aspects whereby creating the standards, and in particular standards for interoperability, give certainly Lumen and AT&T and Verizon and departments and agencies, or whoever's creating their processes, the opportunity to have the transparency, because if X is interoperable with Y, you start to get transparency of what's behind it. You also create an environment where, certainly there's more opportunity for competition. And frankly, on the bottom end, the most important thing perhaps for the United States is an opportunity for innovation. So one, totally support the ORAN kind of capabilities in terms of standards, interoperability. I'm suggesting that it needs to be broader across all segments, which are going to be part of the next generation platform. I'm also suggesting that it also needs to be driven down, further down into the software aspects of it. In particular, the interoperability of the platform, the APIs that sort of connect things and those kind of environments. If we do that as a nation, then we're sort of like that old commercial. We will be the Intel inside. And I think that that will be very powerful.
So Rob, we're just going to bring you into this. So Rob is the Senior Director of the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission, which he directs Task Force 2, which I hope you have a lot of things that have that like emblem on it somewhere. Task Force 2, that sounds really superhero-ish. I think it sounds really cool. But as kind of to Catherine's point, everything eventually touches backhaul, right? It's great if it's wireless or it's satellite, but eventually it's going to hit a wire. So I imagine you guys were spending a lot of time trying to figure out, if it's hitting a wire, how do I know that wire is safe? How do I know that next part of that process is safe, and and then moving forward that we're continuing to keep it safe? Inform us.
Absolutely. And thank you, Shane, for having us. And I agree with pretty much everything that's been said so far. Both
you're keeping notes on the things that you don't, you're going to tell me
Rob,
later.
from Kat. No, yeah, and I think the point about trustworthiness is interesting and important, right? And when the commission took a step back and looked at this issue, obviously we had our initial recommendation in the March 2020 report, and we are now sort of looking at the issue in a little bit more detail. One of the things that we recognized is that there are a bunch of aspects to trustworthiness, and one of those is certainly the jurisdiction under which different parts of the supply chain touch, right? So, for example, if you are touching mainland China, do you become beholden to the Chinese national security law, the Chinese national intelligence law, the Chinese cybersecurity law? And what does that mean for the implications of that supply chain? With that insight, we basically realized that the US is lacking, frankly, certain core industrial capabilities to ensure that we have the production of essential technologies, including next generation telecommunications equipment. That shortcoming of our industrial capacity, I think, opens us up to a number of risks. One of them is the trustworthiness risk, which we already talked about, right? So that's can you trust the component? Can you trust the final good? If you don't really have a great view into the supply chain for that good, or if you do have a great view into the supply chain of that good, and you know that it's touching potentially adversary countries where it may become subject to some malign influence. That's one, right? The second is this question of availability, which I think is underappreciated and undertouched on. And it also almost runs in tension with the first, right? So when we talk about availability in the context of supply chains, we often talk about diversity being a great sort of catalyst for continued availability. I was speaking with a major telco equipment provider earlier today, actually, about this, and they used the example of when COVID hit, they have some manufacturing capability in the United States. For all of the goods and services that they provide to the United States, they try to keep that manufacturing capability outside of China and outside of adversary countries. But when COVID hit, their US factories took a hit. It was tough for them. Europe recovered a little bit more quickly, and they were able to shift some of that manufacturing capability to Europe, which obviously allowed them to continue their operations or get them back up to speed in a much more expedient and importantly in an important way. So when we look at supply chains and we look at availability, we think about geography as an important component of it, but it's not necessarily just onshoring, right? There's a component of identifying key partners, of identifying key allies, and bringing that to bear. And then the final piece that I think about when I think about, in particular, next generation and supply chains is it's a bit of a tangential point, but it's one that Congressman Gallagher brought up, and it's this notion of American competitiveness and innovation. And if we cede all manufacturing to adversary countries, namely China, what does that mean for our continued competitiveness, especially if China is offering sort of all-in-one solutions for next generation next generation networking. So with all of those sort of insights and that risk profile as the backdrop, the commission took a step back and said, okay, well, given that, what does the United States need to be doing from a governmental perspective in order to facilitate, a more robust and clearly trusted supply chain for our critical suppliers, whether, we focus on ICTs, and because we focus on ICTs, that means we touch on things like materials and we touch on things like important components, like what Miriam will talk about with semiconductors. Our final sort of section is on telecommunications equipment. You could write that final section for a myriad of equipment. You could write it for healthcare equipment. You could write it for industrial control systems. You could write it for weapons systems, right? Our focus is on ICT, but we need to be thinking holistically about this as well. And we sort of asked ourselves, okay, given that, what do we need to be doing? And Congressman Gallagher touched on one of the sort of key tenets of that strategy. And our contention is that, yes, there's a bunch of good work going on and Congress has begun to act. And we can get into some of what Congress is doing and the likely implications of that. But we also have things like the NSTAC, right? The National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, who's doing good work on this front. We have Rob's old office at State that's doing good work on this front. We have the DHS ICT Supply Chain Task Force that's doing work on this front. When we looked at the way the US government is organizing around this issue, our contention is not that there is not enough strategy, it's that there are too many strategies and not enough guiding principles. There's too much activity going on, and none of it's really necessarily organized and therefore pulling and pushing in the right direction sort of coherently and together. So we're going to suggest a few different things that we think will help alleviate some of that stress. And it's focused really around 5 principles, and I'm happy to unpack those in greater detail, but I just want to sort of give you the high level thoughts right now. One is identifying those key goods, materials, components, and finished technologies that we deem sort of essential to national security and economic security. The second is, with that list, what do we need to do to ensure that we have minimum viable manufacturing capability, whether it's here or with close partners, in order to ensure that we always have the availability of those goods, components, materials, et cetera. The third piece is then sort of protecting supply chains, right? Recognizing that we're not going to flip the switch and change it so that we have indigenous capacity or trusted partner capacity overnight for all of this manufacturing. We are going to have to rely on China. We are going to have to rely in some cases on Russia for materials. What do we need to do to ensure that we have the right visibility into those supply chains such that we can at least begin to trust them, right? The fifth piece is related to the second one, which is essentially, it's not going to do us any good to build indigenous capacity or partner capacity if we can't compete with China, right? So if we're building indigenous manufacturing capacity, but we're offering the same product for 2x what Huawei or ZTE is offering it, what good are we really doing ourselves? Yes, we are helping ourselves, and one of the components of this strategy is the US government needs to facilitate a market for more robust infrastructure investment that will allow trusted partners, trusted companies, trusted vendors to come in and gain market access. But we also need to do a better job of ensuring global competitiveness for those partner companies, whether it's the likes of whether it's the likes of Ericsson, Nokia, Samsung, right? Apple has a role to play here. Cisco increasingly has an important role to play here in next generation networking as well. Juniper. What are the instruments or the tools that the US government has at its disposal? And we touched on some of them with Rob. The XIM is going to play an incredibly important role here. DFC is going to play an incredibly important role here. USAID is going to play an important role here. I would say the USTDA, the Trade Development Agency, is also going to play an important role. Now, with all of that said, I don't think that the US government, and I don't think that sort of the powers that be in the policy space, are necessarily willing to spend enough money to do it on their own. So there's a key question here about how we then unlock private capital to also facilitate more infrastructure investment in more trusted suppliers, not only at home, but around the world.
Oh, okay. Miriam, I want to bring you in to this conversation because you are that supply chain that we keep talking about, like the very beginning. I feel like you guys are like the birth of time, it's just silicone. That's where it all starts. So Miriam is the Director of Government Affairs at the Semiconductor Industry Association, also known as SIA, and she has worked closely with Congress, the administration, advance key legislation. You guys are doing a great job with the CHIPS Act that we mentioned earlier, as well as you have worked on the Hill. So I think one of the great things about this particular, not only the forum today, but the fact that collectively I know these are the type of people that are working together, is everybody's had the layover experience of understanding what the problem is to get that other person in the room. And you guys have somehow figured out the formula because you're still talking to each other after a report you did 6 months ago. So Miriam, tell us what's going on.
Well, I think it'd be helpful for the audience just to get a bit of a general background on the semiconductor industry, because we keep referring to it, but I think that there's some key things that make the industry very unique in this discussion when we talk about ICT. You know, the industry is America's 5th largest export by revenue. So the other industries that are larger exporters are airplanes, crude oil, refined oil, and automobiles, which we trade places with year by year. And so as you can sense from those numbers, we are actually a huge engine for economic competitiveness and technological leadership for America. And it tracks pretty closely with the history of America, our industry. We came out of Silicon Valley, but out of the post-World War II industrial base. A lot of the scientists that established semiconductor companies came out of partnerships with DoD and Department of Energy, and were preeminent engineers and researchers that figured out that they wanted to take silicon and make it into something amazing. And so now our industry, the US-based industry, supplies to close to 50% of the global semiconductor market. And we have an extremely global and complex supply chain that essentially takes sand and turns it into chips, and uses thousands and thousands of engineers and scientists to do that. And so in order to have access, in order to sort of continue the competitiveness of the US semiconductor industry, we really need access to global markets, because it's an extremely expensive proposition to make a chip. It's really, really important to US competitiveness. And one thing I just want to step back and mention there is the industry actually is the 2nd highest intensity R&D industry in the United States. The only other industry that invests more of their revenue as a percentage is pharma. And so last year we spent about $18 billion in R&D, and these are real scientists in labs trying to figure out how to make computers better, faster, smarter. And they also underlie other technologies that fuel ICT innovation, like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, exascale, which is high performance supercomputing. And so we are strong partners with the US government across a whole range of defense applications and communications applications. And so I think that's why you see, just generally speaking, such a strong focus from Congress and the administration in making sure that America retains its technological leadership in semiconductors, because we play such a fundamental role in the US technological ecosystem, and then quite frankly, quite broadly, in our technological leadership in the 4th industrial revolution, as some people refer to it, and then of course advanced networking, which can be 5G, but will eventually be 6G. So I think it's really important for everybody to take a step back and understand why Congress is so focused on this. You know, the other trends that I think we are all very cognizant of in light of the COVID-19 pandemic is that global demand for ICT is skyrocketing. We're all here doing this virtually. We anticipate that global demand for chips is actually going to increase by 50% from 2020 to 2030. And it will need a related amount of increase in manufacturing facilities. And those facilities are really good jobs, and they're also filled with people who can help innovate on the next best generation of chips, which will fuel, again, AI, quantum, exascale, the industries of the future. Those manufacturing facilities are extremely expensive to build. We have them in 18 states across the United States. But they cost between $10 and $40 billion to build, depending on what type of chip it is. And so 75% of global manufacturing capacity right now is located in East Asia because of the government incentives that are offered by those East Asian countries. And I think this is really important in the ICT context, because ultimately many of those chips are built into ICT products downstream. and are really important to this concept of 5G, where we'll have a sea of sensors that will help push forward innovation in automobiles, manufacturing, service industries across the board. So the semiconductor industry really is the foundational bulwark of technological leadership for really any nation. And again, because it was invented here in America, we already have a natural leadership position. On the R&D front, it's also increasingly important to be able to have a very focused US government investment in R&D in the semiconductor space, and also have manufacturing, because they feed on each other. And so that's why you see in the American Foundries Act and the Chips for America Act, interesting focus on R&D. And truly the US government has had a commitment to semiconductor R&D over the past, since the post-World War II era. But we have recommended that the US government take a step back and reassess their strategy around semiconductor R&D. And we've encouraged them to triple funding in semiconductor R&D. And that right now they spend about 1.7 billion on semiconductor R&D. The industry actually outspends them by a huge, huge multiple, but the US government research is actually very much in a space where the industry is not going to be doing that type of research. And it also includes very significant ICT research on networking and how to best roll out these sea of sensors, and how do we process that data, and what type of compute do we need to as we move into this new world that combines all of this information. I just want to quickly say that I think there's three concepts that policymakers really need to consider: resiliency, which Robert discussed, trust, and then the follow-on impacts of supply chain actions on US competitiveness. So obviously with the COVID-19 pandemic, we were able to continue manufacturing chips, but we need to think through how private industry was able to do that and take cues from private industry on both resiliency and trust, because we do supply chips to some of the most secure devices in the world. And so we want to make sure that as government moves forward, they don't implement standards from a top-down perspective that might actually push industry into a checklist type approach. We need to make sure we're on the very front leading edge of cybersecurity for hardware, which is really a multi-layered approach that needs to take into account architectures that are going to be built in both at the chip level, but then also further along in the manufacturing process, and then further along in the network. So I think resiliency and trust are really important. And then in terms of follow-on impacts from supply chain actions, the reality is we live in a multipolar world. China is a rising power, and it is also a huge population of a huge buyer of chips. So they import more chips than oil in China. And so it's really important to the US semiconductor industry to have access to this market, because whoever has access to this market is going to be able to fuel the R&D of the future. And I think it's really important for policymakers to be able to strike the right balance there in terms of making sure that we secure our supply chains, we look at resiliency and trust, but we also don't cut off the American companies from a really important market. So with that, I'll stop, Shane.
Oh, that's really helpful. You guys really do a great job of explaining the long tail. Congressman sort of alluded to this. It's like, to get the plan in place, we almost needed to start 5 years ago, but at least we're starting now, and we're having the right people in the conversation, because to have the secure networks that Catherine's team wants to have in place, they may need to make the buying decisions, and that all goes backwards, which goes to you, Miriam, saying we have to make the decisions now to make sure that the flow going forward is secure, and we can actually identify that, and we have the trust in the network, so people like Rob Strayer can feel comfortable in his former role and in his current role, saying that we have all of this in place now. Let's roll out the plan and make sure that we're making secure decisions, but also understanding those have to be commercial decisions, which is where this gets tricky, because cost at the end of the day may make the difference to what you buy and what you don't. So this is one. Last week, the FCC came out with their report on what is colloquially known as rip and replace, and that's a huge challenge for everybody, because you want to say, we don't want this Huawei equipment in US networks. However, you get how they got there, right? It was cheaper. The idea of security wasn't necessarily in the process. But now do we turn around and like pay for their bad decision making like they were children who didn't know any better? So how important is security to us at this point? Of course, during COVID, I feel like money doesn't make any difference. We're into hundreds of billions, I don't know anymore.
It's extremely important. And I'll just flag for you, when I worked on the Senate Commerce Committee after the 2008 crash, we worked on a very robust broadband stimulus bill. And at the time, there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not Huawei equipment should be included in as an eligible entity for these funds. And a lot of rural communities ended up using some of these broadband funds to buy Huawei equipment. And so the US government really needs to make sure that it has a cohesive policy moving forward to make sure we don't repeat similar mistakes.
As I said, we're going to just chalk that up to they didn't know at the time. It wasn't the goal. It was 2008, but now we understand. We've had some time.
You're more forgiving than me, Shane.
Right. Oh, okay. Other thoughts on that?
I'm happy to jump in there as well, Shane. And I would just say, the rip and replace issue gets back to something that I think both Catherine and Rob touched on, and it's this notion of openness and interoperability. Mm-hmm. The reason we're in this mess is that, yes, 3GPP, which everything was built to, has open and interoperable elements to it, but then you can build on top of it, which undermines the interoperability between different vendors. And when we look at Huawei, not only do we view them as an untrusted vendor who we want to get out of our networks, but they also pose their 3G and 4G equipment poses interoperability challenges for building 5G on top of it. And I think, with 5G and moving forward, we have an opportunity to not repeat those mistakes of the past. And that's why, not just when we talk about RAN, but when we talk about the backhaul and the data link and all of the different layers of the network, we need to be emphasizing openness and interoperability moving forward for all of our investment. And I would say it's also equally important that we not only do this for our investment here at home, but we lead the way in helping partner countries do that as well. And this is, again, an opportunity for things like our aid money to work in massive favor. And I think this is an incredibly important global competition. And we should be looking at how we ensure that USAID, for example, and projects funded by DFC and EXIM, right, are able to put folks in a position where, maybe they're building out their telecommunication networks to the rural parts of their countries for the first time, aren't repeating the mistakes that we've made in the past where we've allowed Huawei in, and it's kept us in this sort of path-dependent state where we can't actually switch out.
Yeah, and Shane, I'll just add on to that, again, I think that America has an ethos of innovating its way out of problems. And I'd like to make sure that we don't lose sight of that. Ultimately, 5G will come and go, and we will look back and make a determination about whether or not America was in a leadership position on that. But we want to make sure that whatever 6G holds or other advanced types of networking, that we were able to gain enough private revenues to put in the R&D to make sure that we have those new networks, because they might have a completely different financial profile than the deployments that are happening now. So I just want to flag that for the group.
Right, and the technology changes tremendously, so you want to make sure your base is something that you still trust along the way. That makes it really interesting. Other comments on that? Catherine, you're on mute.
You would think the telecom girl would have this down by now. I want to sort of pull the string on some stuff that Rob Morgus brought up, which is sort of we're sort of taking action without a plan, and I think this is somewhat fair in that, one, we certainly, Lumen, communications sector at large, we certainly understand and fully appreciate the implications and the national security implications of this entire dialogue, and completely get it. I think where we continue to struggle, and I think Rob Morgus starts to tease this out, is that with these various venues for discussion about, so how do we mitigate this problem? How do we get ahead of this problem? How do we be strategic about this problem? It's not clear that it's coming together. And furthermore, it's not clear that it's coming together in such a way so that the national security implications are really being balanced with the economic security implications. And and it is very, very clear to us that in most of these things, nobody talked to industry. I mean, for instance, this past week on Monday, as a matter of fact, there were a whole series of comments put forth about the implementation of the FAR associated with the NDAA Section 889, 2019. And it was extraordinary. I mean, I think we understand the intent. I think we understand the purpose. We understood sort of, if you will, the ultimate goals. But there were more than 45 sets of comments by major associations that cover the entire ICT ecosystem, and the interpretation and the questions that are still outstanding, just as they're getting ready to finalize the rules, are along the lines of, well, this is actually against the law for telecom guys. If you implement it the way it is, we can't run FirstNet. If we do this, we're already seeing 5,000 variations on a theme of how people are interpreting it, which seem to be either before or so my point is, clearly we lost an opportunity to have the collaboration with industry, so that as the words were being written, the implications of it and the potential consequences of it could be written in such a way so that we didn't have this kind of massive, last minute, we still don't fully understand what's going on kind of conversation. So to the point about, making the long-term strategy, I think there needs to be an instantiated way. It's something where it's absolutely understood that as we hopefully move forward and create an industrial strategy focused on ICT, that you've got to have the ICT folks there. There's no intent for unwitting consequences, but still through the whole process, because they weren't there at the table to begin with, these unwitting consequences are bubbling up in the last minute. So, I think as well, another thing that we've got to think about is that today there are untrusted vendors in about 70% of Africa, a huge percentage of South America, the Far East. And so even if we make our supply chain really extraordinary over the next 5 to 10 years, we still haven't completely, licked. So what do we do about when we have to pass traffic or operate in untrusted waters, unsafe waters, contested environments? And so we can't lose sight of that aspect as well. And the irony is that being able to secure your own supply chain and yet still operate in perhaps contested or unfriendly waters goes back to leveraging the capabilities that 5G or the next generation capabilities anticipate. So it's almost we have to speed up the deployment of this sort of capability, so that you can dictate how I want things to be secured and transported and routed and handled, because we still have the rest of the globe where we have to do business in, whether it's DoD or the soldiers or factories that are in Africa. And so it's almost by speeding up that kind of capability that we can actually navigate those unsafe waters more effectively.
And
Sorry, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I'd just like to echo those comments and just flag that some good work is being done on the security side of research. DoD, DARPA, and the semiconductor industry had a program called SHIELD that has evolved into a new program, AISS, and they look very closely at hardware security issues and are trying to push the envelope to make sure that it's multi-layered and dealing with a really dynamic set of threats that aren't going away and will likely get worse as we move into a highly interconnected world. So I think Catherine's point is actually incredibly important moving forward, and I'd just like to echo them.
So Rob, sure, I was going to ask you to come in on, Catherine's kind of brought up a lot of things that we need to do for ITI, and I kind of feel, ITC, and true, and ITI is going to be doing that, but you were kind of the front lines for a lot of this. I mean, how does that parlay? And then the challenge of where we're kind of saying we need to be safe on our shores and we'll figure out how to wash the traffic because we don't really trust what's coming off of what your nodes and what you guys are doing. And you don't have, you're running an unsafe network.
Yeah, well, first I would say I just totally agree with Catherine that it's important that the private sector be involved in helping bake and formulate the policy. Our companies are always saying they want to be involved in the policy-making process, because we have the best insights into how the networks are evolving, how the technology is evolving, how we can ensure that we're not choosing a pathway through regulation that's not going to allow sort of the best innovative outcomes in the long term. I will say, the key word being, I think, for all this, that one have a risk-based approach that really is risk-based in the most comprehensive outlook possible. The world we live in now is not just a national security narrow analysis that can occur of technical capabilities. One also has technical flaws or opportunities for penetration. One also has to think about how this all plays into the bigger picture with trade arrangements, with discriminatory regulatory practices that could occur as a second order consequence of our activity, and of the long-standing concerns that many companies have had with China's state-owned enterprises and state-dominated enterprises, setting basically unfair market conditions or playing in the market in unfair ways that have caused there not to be fair competition. All companies are eager to engage in the competitive environment if it's a level playing field and not tilted in one direction. So I think that one, as a policymaker, needs to bring both the economic and the national security aspects of the problem together to have a fulsome approach. And I think that's what many parts of the Solarium report read to me that was brought together. But I think that it's always going to be a challenge. It's easy for me to pontificate about this, but as Congressman Gallagher and others said, core principles have to include the economic and the national security in the most broad way of looking at the aspects of those challenges.
So I'm getting one of the questions here that it's always been, what do we think about clean networks? Is this what we're describing, or is there something else that is layered in that the Secretary of State was trying to get at a couple of weeks ago when he was saying we're working on clean networks? I know it's stunning.
I'm in an awkward spot for, I can't really answer for the State Department at this point, but let me just say that, Undersecretary Keith Kroc and Secretary Pompeo, I think that at the core of their leadership in this area was thinking about 5G and all connected digital technologies, and how we can ensure that they're secure, and how that the American people can be protected when using connected devices. And so that's the core of that, whether that's looking at 5G or submarine cables or the diplomatic posts reach back into the United States. And again, I think from now being outside of that, I think that many companies just would say, we just want to be part of the discussion and formulating the policies that are thoughtful in this area. And I think Miriam was highlighting a number of those ways that particularly the semiconductor industry wants to be part of it. It can be part of it. Any
other comments on clean networks? We figured that out like I did, just kind of put it together in my head one day. I was like, I think we're doing it.
Shane, since I'm all about networks, I think that the 5 components, when you really understand what they're trying to achieve, make sense. They do. I think the problem, if you will, is that clean network somehow, presumes that somehow State Department is going to be able to clean every network, which goes back to my point that no, there are going to be some times where you can't clean the network because they don't belong to you, and if I want to deliver traffic to a soldier who's in the green zone, who happens to, the local provider happens to be someone that's Huawei, am I not going to terminate the call to that soldier? And of course the answer is no. And the Clean Networks document does not suggest that. But the average person hearing that, I think, misinterprets. So I think that, as they continue to move down, for instance, removing the certain apps, is part of that sort of clean network initiative, being able to focus on, do we have enough resources that can take care of undersea cables? These are all good initiatives. So I think the intent is good. I think that the marketing might not be so articulate to the average person.
Yeah, it's sort of left out there, and for us to kind of imprint on it what we thought we were dealing with.
Exactly.
Yeah, Shane, I'll just add to that, trust can definitely be really bolstered by these risk-based assessments, but you can also make assumptions of zero trust that can guide some of the testing and assurance protocols. that the US government has in place. And that's something that the private sector does on a daily basis. And so I just want to flag that as something that I think is not being discussed at the high level that Clean Networks is at, but is certainly being dealt with on a day-to-day basis for companies that are operating in the commercial space.
Rob, Morris, one of the things that you brought up in one of our pre-discussions was how we're looking at this, and this is a collaborative effort for so many of the companies, is how do we deal with the technology transfer challenge, intellectual property, as well as the theft of, and then inappropriate trade practices where people aren't following the rules.
If I had the full answer to that question, I don't think I'd be here. I don't think we'd be here. But I will say,
I would visit you on the yacht that you do plan on.
Yeah, exactly. But I will say, we can learn a little bit from what some of our friends and partners around the world are doing on this front, right? So, there's a lot. This issue is an onion. There are so many different layers to it. But I think one of the things that's really intriguing to me is I look at Japan and the work that they've been doing lately, working with their industrial champions to move some of their manufacturing out of China. And that is in subsidizing that movement. And it doesn't have to move back to Japan, but it needs to go to a jurisdiction where we feel like it's less likely that Chinese intelligence operatives are going to get their hands on that core IP, that core material. I think, moving out of China is not going to solve the problem, but it's going to increase the cost of Chinese industrial espionage. If we no longer are fabricating, testing, assembling, packaging our core sort of technologies in China and then shipping them back over here, it's going to increase the cost and it's going to increase the burden on Chinese intelligence operatives to continue to sort of leech all of that technology off of us.
I love the idea that it'll just become too expensive to spy all the time.
They've got budgets.
Things to spy on. We can't spy on everything all the time because we can right now.
Yep, they've got budgets and they have to stay within those. And we've seen stuff like this somewhat work when we put strain on intelligence agencies that are conducting offensive cyber operations, for example. If we continue to drive up the cost of them conducting offensive cyber operations, they have to pick and choose where they actually conduct those operations.
Ian, I'd love to speak to this just very briefly because there's mention of assembly tests and other things that are related to the semiconductor industry. But one thing I just want to flag for people listening in is, the semiconductor industry undergoes a technological revolution every year. So they re-engineer all the chips that we use every year, and it requires thousands and thousands of scientists, which I have mentioned before. And so industrial espionage, while harmful, if the US continues to maintain its competitive edge, it actually lessens the harm of industrial espionage because we can continue to leap ahead. One thing I'll also flag is because we're making this very, very sharp transition to AI-powered communications technologies, that's particularly a space where the US currently has a lead in the hardware space due to the semiconductor industry. And so we want to make sure that we protect American IP, but we don't take such drastic actions that we throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so I think it's really important to note that our access to East Asian markets is really powering our competitiveness. We're not the loser in the situation. We're actually still the winners on the IP front. And so it's really important to approach it from that perspective.
I just want to hop on that too. And I think there's the people aspect of it can't be overlooked. Just sort of the importance of the engineering expertise and sort of the role that plays. But it also adds a potentially confounding variable here, because I don't know if folks saw the news from, I think it was sort of mid last month, but Huawei poached, I think it was over 100 TSMC engineers, right? So that's another way that we're sort of seeing some forced tech transfer. They basically just outbid TSMC on gathering sort of core and key engineers from obviously one of the leading semiconductor fabrication plants in the world.
And I think the real issue there is that we haven't really talked about, but actually has a significant impact on the ICT supply chain in general, is our access to talent in the United States. So we really need to be attracting the best and brightest in ICT engineering and semiconductor engineering. And that has never been a challenge for the United States. I'm a first generation American. My parents came here in the STEM field. And I think it's really important that we continue to do that. I would surmise that many of those engineers, if given the choice to emigrate to China or the United States, would pick the United States over China.
I'm wondering if they're going to have to do more landfill to keep making Singapore bigger, because that's where everybody's moving. They're like, can't go to Taiwan right now. We're going to Singapore. And you're like, wow, it's going to be crowded on that little island. I have a question from Claude Barfield, who some of you may know, and I'm absolutely going to give him deference, Miriam, for you. It says, how does the balance of the semiconductor industry point that you need to keep lines of supply open with China, while the US government increasingly is moving to cut off Chinese companies from your suppliers? I hope that makes sense. I just read it out loud.
It's extremely hard to balance. I mean, the reality is that many of the chips that are supplied to China go into things that are not necessarily national security related at all. It could be a smartwatch. It could be a dishwashing machine. It could be a 3G flip phone. And so we need to maintain access to the Chinese markets. It's really important for the industry's global competitiveness. And quite frankly, not just Chinese markets, but global markets writ large. And so, we've been paying very, very close attention to all of the trade actions that the administration has taken, and we have weighed in. When it comes to national security issues, we have to defer to the national security experts. If we can't sell to a company because they're a national security threat to the United States, we can't do that. And so we're very respectful of that. We're very cognizant of that. And we have deep partnerships with, really key parts of the national defense industrial base that we work with. So it's a balance, but I think that there is a recognition at the highest levels of the US government that we need to continue the positive impact of selling abroad semiconductors so that we can fuel domestic R&D. And so I'll just leave it at that.
Okay, this is an open question to all of you. It says, there's a lot out there for securing the supply chain, but what isn't clear is if the US government is going to set up some mandates for companies in foreign countries. How will that work? There's a potential conflict between onshoring versus working with allies. Is this US going to mandate that other countries stop supplying China with products that have become connected to the US? I don't have a USTR brain to go through all that, but that sounds like some things we need to think about. You all look as perplexed as I do.
I can jump in there and just say, I don't have a crystal ball and I don't know where USG is going to go on this.
You sound a little disappointed on your skill set today, Rob.
I know. I'm down on myself. I don't know what to tell you. But I think, a prudent strategy, and I'm not necessarily saying this is one that will be taken, but a prudent strategy would be to do as much as we can to not alienate our partners and allies. I think placing demands without adding some carrots in some way, shape, or form is just misguided straight up. And I think, if we take a step back and we take a risk-based approach, which we've all kind of been advocating for here, we'd come to realize that placing stringent demands on partners and allies without sort of helping them, facilitating them, meeting those demands, or, even just placing them without sort of consulting them just would be a terrible misstep strategically.
Rob, do you have any comments on, can we play good with the other kids on the play yard there? Can we keep being nice and still get what we want?
Yeah, I think so. In the sense that, if you're thoughtful and transparent and you do things in iterative ways and so you can calibrate, I think there's ways to achieve the kind of joint goals sometimes in competition, which is to achieve national security goals without hurting our competitiveness and our supply chains and our partner supply chains. I think that can be done in ways of collaboration with the international partners too, to try to get them on board with any security measures that we take so that we're not doing them just by ourselves and potentially hurting companies in the US and not getting the rest of the world, the sort of allied friends and family of the world on board with our policy. But again, their incrementalism is easier to get people to the kind of longer term outcome.
All right, we've got a minute left. So closing thoughts from y'all. Catherine, we'll start with you.
Again, Lumen, the communication sector, we understand the issues that are being addressed. We certainly support all these goals. I think the key ask is we've got to be able to develop the strategy together. You can't be done without industry. It does have to be done in a manner that's risk informed and, oh heavens, consistent. It has to reflect the fact that this ICT space is global. It is boundaryless, and so it has to be done in such a way so that it recognizes that, and it has an eye to assure that it retains sort of the open internet, open global marketplace, because that's what really, is sort of what we're all about, and sort of what the approach, the industrial strategy in this space should be ultimately supporting. The last thing that I think that has to be done, and this I think is the hardest thing for governors or states and the nation, is that this has to be done in such a way so that it's understood that this is going to take long time over numerous administrations, and so that consistency, sustainability of the strategy has to be supported. So I think that'll be the major challenge.
Miriam, final thoughts? You taught us a lot.
If I can just go, I'll just say briefly, I agree with everything Catherine just said. I think the concept of national security has to go with the economic competitiveness in any analysis. And I think that for a long time, policymakers were only in one camp or the other. Now they totally need to be fused together, and that's the way forward.
Yeah, and I would echo Rob and Catherine's comments, and I would just leave with the thought that the private sector has incredible competencies in the ICT space. So having them have a really robust role in this discussion will end up being beneficial to both economic security and national security.
Rob Morris, get the last word.
Absolutely. I think, this has been a great discussion. If we, when I look at the strategy and the things that we need, risk-based, we've already touched on that. We need to take a hard look at what we need indigenously, what we need here at home. It's not everything, but it's certainly some things, right? It needs to be collaborative. And I think we talked a lot about the ICT sector being involved. I think that also includes international partners, but I also think you need to look down the supply chain. You need to look at the semiconductor and chip industry and bring them into this conversation more robustly. You need to maybe even look sort of at the rare earth element mining and refining industries. You need to look at the ways that we pull silicone out of the earth and refine it, and whether there need to be sort of minor adjustments made in the way that we allow or don't allow that to happen in the United States. And then the final piece is this competitiveness piece. And I think, the keys to ensuring competitiveness are myriad, but I would toss out, we need to emphasize openness. We need to emphasize interoperability. Those will be important for competitiveness in the context of ICT equipment. But we also need to ensure that we're price competitive. And we need to ensure that we're product competitive, that we're offering products that are actually able to compete in terms of functionality and the features with Huawei, with ZTE, with others. And I would just finally say the US government is not going to be able to do this on its own. I think some of the figures that Miriam quoted, the $10 billion to spin up manufacturing capability for semiconductors, and the need to do that over and over and over again, right? That's a massive project. The USG taxpayer dollars are not going to be able to do that on their own. And we need to figure out a better way to unlock private capital to do that. And when there's a quick way to make a quick buck with software, that's a difficult prospect to sort of divert some of that to hardware. So it's just something we need to take a close look at.
Great. Thank you all so much for being in this discussion. I wish you lots of luck. Please keep us posted on how it's going, because we're going to be paying attention. And have a great going into your weekend, knowing that you just made a bunch of people a lot smarter.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
Thank you, Shane.
Everybody.